suspendu. Sitôt qu'on le touche, il résonne. De Bérangère. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit.
Referential. The referential function of setting. Setting functions as a bridge between the story, plot, and the world to which it refers, and is about. With regard to setting, Kennedy et al. Are minimalist. Setting is, quote, the time and place of a literary work. Abrams and Harfman, more expansive and helpful. They describe setting as the element of the story that, quote, generates the conflicts, defines the characters, and gives the story purpose and meaning. So much so that there would be little, if any, story left if all the details somehow transported to a different time, place, and social milieu. Setting is functional. Time, place, and social milieu matter, and setting situates the story in a time, a place, a social milieu. And a few of you get into this. A few of you noted in passing, Gilman's setting is, quote, a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate. Just in those two phrases, a lot of work is done by the author in creating a referential bridge between the story and plot and the world outside to which it refers. Gilman's setting, a colonial mansion, a hereditary state in which wealthy upper-class people may be expected to live. You see how setting points to purpose and meaning. One purpose of the story could be to characterize the lives of rich colonials living on an estate that's been in the family for some time. That's the hereditary element. Note, however, Denise's refinement. Denise, reading carefully, notes, quote, the narrator states it is not often that ordinary people like her and her husband acquire homes like this. Obviously, there was some tradition in having a colonial mansion, but at the same time, the description of it makes it seem like the home itself presents a bad omen. The social milieu is thus important. Gilman takes pains to sketch it in. The husband we find is a physician, one target of the story, or should we say plot, remember last week. The institution of medicine is practiced at this time and in this place. How could that not be said to be one of the targets of the story's meaning and its purpose? To characterize the institution of medicine is practiced at this time and in this place. But another target, perhaps, this is the one delineated by Denise, I believe, is the doctor's social aspiration. An ordinary person having bought a mansion, is he not a social climber? Is it not suggested that he is such? His wife being along for the ride. Tradition, as Denise notes, might also be a target. Various traditions, one of which I think we could describe as patriarchal.
From the referential to the atmospheric, pretty close to the symbolic, but not identical. The atmospheric use of setting establishes mood. It creates an emotional weather, so to speak, through which the characters will be making their ways. Often enough, the atmospheric is created by way of reports on the weather. Characters often acknowledge it now and then, try to ignore it or defy it implicitly, if not explicitly, and even come to discover it as a truth that has thus far eluded them. I'm thinking of the endings of stories in which the sun comes out, and the setting itself, seems to offer something of a comment on prospects and hopes of the character at hand. Now, you could say that's a symbol, right? You could. So you're going to see at times a bordering between of the atmospheric on the symbolic and the symbolic on the atmospheric to such a degree that you're going to feel as though the distinction is really not all that important to me. But I want to give you one example of what seems to me to be, perhaps in all the English language, that's a pretty bold claim, isn't it? But perhaps in all the English language, one of the greatest examples of such mood setting as would, I think, constitute evidence that we really do want this term atmospheric, okay? Because you wouldn't quite call this symbolic. You'd call some of what I'm about to read symbolic, but I think you'd mostly call it atmospheric. It's establishing, once again, a kind of emotional context for the story, okay, in which the characters then will move. It's almost as though the emotions of the author, okay, are just writ large in the scenery, okay, in such a way as to constitute an authorial presence, okay, against which the characters move, and which conditions our sense of the characters, right? Serves characterization. It serves a lot of ends, but characterization is one of the most obvious. And you can imagine that a dreary situation in which we had a character who was resolutely remaining cheerful, you can imagine how that would help us to characterize that particular character, right? It would help the author to do so and enable us to grasp that character as remarkably plucky, for example, in the face of horrible weather. Horrible weather, not of the kind of where you're rained upon so much as the kind where it's actually part of the plot of the story, right? But more like just kind of sitting out there. It's very depressing, and somehow it doesn't bother the character. The character refuses to allow it to bother her as she goes about her business. That character may come across as more heroic than not. But let's get to that famous example. Perhaps you will recognize it. Maybe not, but I, in fact, label it there at the very end. Here it goes. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I almost want to pause. Let's press on another sentence or two. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable, because poetic sentiment, upon which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought to which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. Okay, that's perhaps enough. I've included some of the rest of this opening paragraph of the famous The Fall of the House of Usher, which maybe some of you read before. It's one of my favorite short stories of all the 19th century, all 19th century American literature, that's for sure. But I think it's a pretty good example of what we're talking about here. I mean, you have, do you not, the symbolic. It's here. I think there are moments where the house, for example, becomes a symbol, right? Where would that happen? Okay, when would you have the symbolic? Well, I think the line, I looked upon the scene before me, the mere house, the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls. Not there. Walls can be bleak and they don't really symbolize much, aside from bleakness, but that's atmospheric, isn't it? But look at the next line. Upon the vacant eye-like windows. We move on quickly, upon a few rank sedges and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, which again returns us to the atmospheric register from the symbolic. Now, we haven't quite gotten to the symbolic. That's our next plate. But already, do you not see Manipulation of setting to symbolic effect. The vacant eye-like windows. It's as though the house of Usher is staring upon him. That's the title of the story. You've already read the title of the story by the time you've read this paragraph. The house of Usher stares upon him. Vacancy, staring upon him through its windows, as it were, which, by the way, return at the very end of the paragraph. They stare upon him with the vacancy of a kind of non-present subject, a subject that is there but not there, not all there, right? As it stares out of these windows contained within the house. Drop down to that final sentence where he says, acting upon this idea, he's just had an idea. He reports, reining his horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that, again, I see as more atmospheric than specifically, pointedly symbolic. A black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling. And he gazes down and looks in the tarn. But with a shudder even more thrilling than before, what does he see? He says he looks upon the remodeled, which I think means mirrored, the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the gas slate tree stems and the vacant and eye-like windows. So a lot of attention here at the end of the paragraph is called, I think, to those windows by the choice of the image of the vacant and eye-like windows as the terminal image of this this paragraph that's just so full of images, right? And I think it calls a little bit of attention to a particular element of the setting that, once again, I would distinguish from the atmospheric portions of the setting, which is the great majority of what we have happening in this paragraph. And this, which strikes me as more specifically symbolic, where the family, not just the house of Usher, the family of the Ushers, the whole, if you've read the story, you'll know what I'm talking about, the lineage of the Ushers, the whole long history of the Usher family, okay, can now but look out of the windows of the house that symbolizes their continuance, their continuation in the present. They can only look out vacantly upon him, and he feels the gaze upon him, and it feels, I think you would agree, a little bit unsettling, okay? So this strikes me as just a little bit more than establishing a kind of, contingent of emotions that are extant, that just sit out in the landscape, sit out in the, in the kind of surrounding context of the scene, okay? And again, seem to represent some kind of authorial presence here. And the feelings, it's almost as though that's how the author feels, okay? Is somehow communicated by these, and there's some suggestion that that's how we ought to feel, and is somehow communicated by these various elements, which are here, by the way. One of the things that makes it such an amazing example is that, of course, we see the character report on the precise emotional content of the atmosphere, of this atmospheric setting, when he tells you that as he looks at the building, and again, the weather is there. We've got clouds hanging oppressively low in the heavens, right? So it's a cloudy day, dull, dark, and soundless in the autumn of the year, right? So we in a sense, we have the weather, we have the seasons. It's not just that, it's also the building. So it's not just the weather when you've got the atmosphere, not just the sky, not literally atmosphere. Atmosphere is a metaphor. So you also have the building, but you look at the building, and how is the building, upon the first glimpse of the building, if you're the main character, and we have this, again, precise, wonderfully exemplary and precise emotional equivalent or emotional effect of the atmosphere is reported in this moment. So if somebody said to you, well, what are the emotions communicated by the choice of elements included in the setting of the opening of the Fall of the House of Usher, you'd be able to just smile and pick up the book, pick up the story, and just quote, I would say, quote, a sense of insufferable gloom pervading the spirit. And you'd be right.
The symbolic, then. This one's pretty clear now. Authors manipulate elements of setting, not just in order to create social and historical reference points and relevancies. That's the referential. And not just in order to establish an emotional mood or tone. That's the atmospheric, which they might wish to do for any number of characterological reasons that have to do with establishing character, though also for other reasons, sometimes even referential ones. But also, characters, or rather authors, manipulate elements of setting also in order to create suggestive correspondences, by means of which to advance the plot and clarify, or at least indicate, the theme. What about atmospherics in Gilman? We've been over this. As we've seen, courtesy of Gabrielle, the narrator's, quote, disgust and loathing of her situation are established early on, even as the wallpaper is hung up, as it were, before the reader. Repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow. The difference then between the symbolic use of setting, symbolic function of setting, and the merely atmospheric use, setting becomes symbolic and not merely atmospheric when its elements escape the atmospheric background to become the focus in their own right. Okay? The wallpaper works atmospherically, perhaps even referentially. Is it a rich person's wall covering? Maybe rich people will have fancy yellow wall coverings, but also symbolically. Abrams Harvem identifies symbol as, quote, a word or phrase that signifies an object or event which in its turn signifies something or suggests a range of reference beyond itself. That's what a symbol is, a word or phrase that signifies an object or event which in its turn signifies something or suggests a range of reference to something beyond itself. Here the very color does just that. For yellow, a feature or quality of an object, the wallpaper, is a traditional symbol. Think of the story we would have, probably, if the title of the story were the golden wallpaper rather than the yellow wallpaper. Wouldn't you expect something very different? Henry James wrote a novel called The Golden Bowl, not the Yellow Bowl. And Doris Lessing wrote a book called The Golden Notebook, not the Purple Notebook. And turn this around. Alice Walker wrote a book called The Color Purple, not the color yellow. Think of the difference that would make if, in fact, those colors were different in those various novels, maybe one of which you may have read. Think of yellow as opposed to golden or white, even if we're not aware of what yellow might signify unto itself. When we think of gold, when we think of white, we think of yellow. We get something, don't we? One thing we know about yellow, it's not white, it's not gold. When we're thinking about white and then we think about yellow, we think of something spoiled or faded, right? Stale, contaminated. At the very least, something unwholesome, smoldering, unclean. This is a more precise significance of yellow, beyond its vague atmospheric emotional suggestion of, quote unquote, disgust and loathing. Moreover, and this is crucial, the yellow of the wallpaper is more than a means of establishing an emotional atmospheric backdrop. It is of interest in its own right. There's nothing retiring about the wallpaper, about the yellow in the wallpaper, moving into the foreground. Rather, it calls attention to itself. This is something that a number of you note in your discussion board contributions. Indeed, she, the narrator, becomes fascinated by the yellow, by the wallpaper, as if trying to understand it. She's fascinated by the color unto itself, which is what we're talking about in this moment. The coloring, the coloration. The narrator herself calls attention to the color and its significance, to the variations in color on the wallpaper and what they might mean. You remember that comment, a few of you quoted it. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. Audra, quote, while noting yellow is usually a happy color, this is the narrator's personal symbol. It does not bring joy. It invites her deeper to madness. Unquote. The notion of a personal symbol I find very interesting. Gilman exploits the traditional meanings associated with the color, but gives them, or has her narrator give them, a personal twist. Emily quotes the narrator helpfully, quote, there are things in that paper which nobody knows but me, or ever will. There you have the personal. It's a personal significance to that paper that no one else but the person at hand is privy to. The narrator herself insists on the personal meaning of the wallpaper. Here we begin to see the suggestive complexity of Gilman's symbolism, which I think you would agree, and certainly your discussion board contributions indicate this, that you would agree, that her symbolism is not limited to the color yellow, right, but to the wallpaper colored yellow, taken as a whole. The wallpaper, which is yellow, the yellow wallpaper, is itself a complex, complicated symbol. Note the range of reference of which Abrams and Harpham speak. The wallpaper is yellow. That matters. We've seen why. But it's also other things. It's an object that, unlike most paper we use daily, has surprising, wondrous, perhaps fearsome depth. Color and pattern lie on the surface. What lies or creeps beneath? Something does. Some shape or shapes. Quote, behind that outside pattern, the dim shapes get clearer every day. It is always the same shape, only very numerous. And it is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind that pattern. I don't like it a bit. I wonder, I begin to think, I wish John would take me away from here. Yeah, but John is the problem, isn't he? Symbolic number 2, he's one of the problems. The yellow wallpaper is the symbol, we have been saying. Not just the yellow in the wallpaper, not just the patterns in the wallpaper, but the paper colored yellow, characterized by its yellowness, characterized by its patterns, characterized as well by this kind of sort of thickness where it becomes its own space. This is one of the strangest aspects of the story, it seems to me. The paper is a kind of medium, a spirit medium, a space in which the narrator's spirit finds enabling refuge that at times looks like confinement when you look at what this narrator's spiritual projection of her own self is doing in that space, especially with respect to the patterns, as a number of you noticed. I'm going to start that over. The paper is a kind of medium, a space in which the narrator's spirit finds enabling refuge, as well as confinement, leaving the narrator's consciousness, okay, that's the voice that we're listening to tell the story, outside, looking in a mirror that she takes for a window. I'll repeat the last part of that because I think it's pithy, needs unpacking. Though, once again, I'm going by what you said. Which I felt was right on target. The narrator's consciousness is outside. That voice is somehow outside of this spirit medium into which her soul, her spirit, seems to have been projected. She's not aware of that, though. The narrator's consciousness is outside. She's really looking in a mirror. She's looking at herself, okay? But she doesn't see it as such. She takes it for a kind of window that enables her to look upon another, right? And that we could see as the source of her madness. If she would be aware of what she was doing, this would not be a story about madness. It would be a story in which a grieved consciousness or a grieved sensibility, an aggrieved person, okay, had come to consciousness, come to self-consciousness, come to self-awareness. We don't really have that. We have something else. Ultimately, you see how complex all this is. Ultimately, the walls behind the paper, as well as the room itself, quote unquote, the nursery, come to function symbolically, right? You just think about the room itself as a nursery, right? And you get the sense of her infantilization by her husband, do you not? It's all very complex. And I want to give Brandy credit for one of the best phrases in all the discussion board when she spoke of a symbol within a symbol, or symbols within symbols, which is what I think we have in the complex symbolism of Gilman. So exploring a little further and coordinating your insights and giving you guys the credit for some of these insights by actually mentioning you by name, which is my habit, right? What about the pattern in particular? Denise notes how in the pattern the narrator can see curves. Denise was not the only one who was interested in these curves, which, quote, suddenly commit suicide. This is a quote from the story itself. Plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. The narrator's alter ego, right, that projection of her own identity out into the wall in the woman amidst the patterns on the wall. The narrator's alter ego must negotiate these curves, which of course are the pattern. Just as she herself must find a way through. She herself, the narrator, must find a way through a deadly patriarchal pattern of life that is going on around her. And Montserrat was quite good on this question. Montserrat, the quote, woman in the patterns seems to be climbing as if she's trying to set herself free from the main pattern, that confining the narrator herself, that looks like bars of the domestic cage. The woman in the wall symbolizes, acts out the narrator's own reaction to her husband's ownership, which was Amira's quite well-chosen word, of her, right? Making this very fundamental connection between the woman in the wall and the woman outside of the wall, looking at the wall, is really a key to making any sense whatsoever of this complex story. Well, what about the wallpaper itself as a thing unto itself, as stuff hanging on the wall? Dulce, I thought, was nice on this. The wallpaper itself, which at one point she wishes to rip apart, quote, can be compared to her frail mental state. You know, you get the sense of John where he, you know, and this is a big if, this is a big were he aware of her condition and it's anything even remotely approaching its true complexity, he might see the wallpaper as such, right? And you can imagine what John would do as if he were a good doctor, a good sensitive doctor who was sensitive to his wife's condition, maybe even a good husband. He would realize that, you know, the stuff hanging on the wall right there, you know, you have to be kind of careful around it because it, you know, as Dulce says, she wishes to rip it apart. That would almost seem to be, speaking of suicide in the passage up above, it was quoted by one of you in the passage up above, what I shared with you just above, is seems to be a self-destructive kind of act. You get the feeling that without that paper and without this psychodrama of projecting her own spirit into it, that she might be in an even worse condition, right? But the big point right here is that we have, you know, extraordinary complexity going on in this story with respect to symbolism. Because the closer you look at the symbol, the more you see symbols within symbols, to go back to Brandy's phrase, which I think is accurate and illuminating. Well, what about the woman in the wall? In a sense, we've already been through this, but here goes. This is what you had to say about it. Brandy, quote, she began identifying herself as the woman she saw in the patterns of the yellow wallpaper, correctly. Well, I want to say, first of all, correct, Brandy. But I also want to ask, and here's a series of questions, did she do so correctly? She does, correct? She to identify herself as the woman she saw in the patterns of the yellow wallpaper is, in fact, a step in the direction of insight, it seems to me. Now, she doesn't take other steps and kind of see what she's doing by way of that identification. There's just this sort of primal identification and fundamental basic identification between herself and the woman in the wall. She never says, it's as though I'm a woman in a wall. It's as though I'm that woman in the wall, which would, again, be a step in the direction of self-awareness and insight into her condition. And we don't get that, right? Nevertheless, you can't help but pause and say that that is potentially, at least, you know, a very healthy thing for her to see. It may not be a healthy thing for her to be projecting the woman into the wall to begin with, but having done so, you could almost argue she would be able to read more accurately her sense, which I don't think she's really all that able to read carefully and accurately. You know, her own needs, what it is that's going on, what her lack is, and what her desire and need is, right? Because I think the woman, again, is a projection of her own needs. She doesn't look at the woman in the wall insightfully. She does not see what she's doing. Thus, she submits to a condition that a number of you bordered upon calling it this, self-haunting. She is someone who's haunted by herself. Having, in a sense, turned herself into a ghost, she then submits to being haunted by that ghost, which is to say by herself. Until in the end, which is the ending you guys, a number of you were interested in this as well, until in the end she loses her everyday self altogether and becomes that ghost. Audra, in the end, quote, she's finally entered the wallpaper world. Absolutely. Although you could argue that what has happened is the wallpaper world has entered her world. It is kind of, in a sense, spilled over into the so-called real world and has filled it and become it. In the end, the room in which she lingers, quote, symbolizes the state of the narrator's life, as Audra said. Gabrielle quoted the narrator accordingly. Quote, "It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please." So we get this, I think you would agree, kind of sick kind of freedom that she enjoys at the very end of the story. Okay. In which, well, we could, we spent enough time exploring the complexities of the story, but you see that's not a good ending. Okay, let's leave it at that for now. It's not a good ending. It's in some ways the worst of all possible endings that we could possibly have. And if we were in class right now, we'd spend about 15 minutes just exploring everything that we've just said in greater detail. But that's enough for now. Wait until we get to Kafka, by the way. You'll remember that line, from Gilman. "It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please." Indeed, wait until we get to Kafka. You don't have to wait long. Onward, inward. You're about to read another story about withdrawal, madness, confinement, art and the imagination or aesthetic impulse, as we will see. Not something we talk that much about. That you could argue that there's a touch of the artist about that narrator of Gilman's story. And we will certainly see that that is the case for Gregor Samsa, who is the hero of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and who suffers the presence of his family, much as the narrator of Gilman's story suffers the presence of hers. As you will see, and this is one of the first things I would like you to do as you begin reading for next week, is note just how close the scenario is to that conjured by Gilman. This time, not a wife and a mother, but a son.